Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to hear God speak to us now as we read Job chapter 3, and the page numbers should be on the screen. So Job chapter 3, start at verse 1, read the whole chapter. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said a boy is born. That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night, may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now, I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins, with rulers who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? There, the wicked cease from turmoil, and there, the weary are at rest. Captives also enjoy their ease. They no longer hear the slave drivers shout. The small and the great are there, and the slave is freed from his master. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than for hidden treasure, who are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave? Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighing comes to me instead of food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jack, for that reading. When I was at university, I didn't do the sort of travel through the summer thing. Instead, I spent 2 summers of my university summer holidays driving a 7.5-ton truck around the Lake District, delivering groceries to pubs and hotels. It was a toughish gig. I started at 5 a.m., I worked 6 days a week, and I manually shifted about 3 tons of frozen chips every single day. By the end of that summer, or those 2 summers, I was super fit. I'd only crashed the truck twice. And most importantly of all, I'd amassed a colossal sum of money from my £100 a week salary, which, of course, was given to me in a little brown envelope on a Friday afternoon. And what I did with that money was I took it to the local jewellers in Kendal to spend on an engagement ring for the young woman who I hoped would say yes when I offered it to her, which you'll be glad to hear she did. Now, I don't know whether you've ever done this, but when you go to the jewellers with your wad of cash and say, rather naively, "What can I get for this?" The answer can be a little bit disconcerting, a little bit disappointing, because the ring you can actually afford can get lost in the glitz and the bling of the window, and you're thinking, wow, diamonds are expensive. I might need to work another summer before I pop the question. But then the jeweler takes your ring and places it on that little black cushion, that jet black cushion. And away from all the other glitz of the window and on the little jet black cushion, your perception changes dramatically, because it's there against that dark backdrop that the diamond is revealed for the pure, bright, precious thing that it is. And that, I hope, is going to be something close to our experience this morning. Because, as Joe said, we come this morning without question to one of the darkest, most desperate and depressing passages in the entire Bible. There's no praise, there's no worship, there's no light, there's no hope. Only cursing and protest and lament. If my aim, as I said last week, is to get us to love the book of Job, then surely this is one we could have skipped, isn't it? Surely this is one of those chapters that we just have to kind of get through and grit our teeth like a child swallowing a dose of bitter medicine. But to think like that would be a tragic mistake. To see why, have a look with me at how the chapter begins. Look at verses 1 and 2 again. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, notice 3 things. First, after this reminds us to make sure that we don't take this chapter in isolation, but we read it in the context of the whole book. It's an obvious thing to say, but it's an important thing to say that chapter 3 follows chapters 1 and 2, and chapter 3 comes before what comes after. This chapter, therefore, is Job's response to what has happened in chapters 1 and 2, and the issues raised in the chapter will actually rumble on for the rest of the book, and they won't get resolved until the very end. So we need to come back and keep listening, but we also need to read it this morning in context. That's the first thing. Secondly, in verse 1 we read, Job opened his mouth, he said. This is the beginning of the dialogue that will take up most of the rest of the book. Job chapter 2 ended with 7 days of silence, speechless silence from Job and his 3 friends. We're told in 2:11 that his 3 friends came to sympathize with Job and comfort him, but it turns out they have nothing to say. They have nothing to say until Job himself speaks. So just glance over at chapter 4, verse 2, when Eliphaz says, if someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient, but who can keep from speaking? Well, they haven't spoken for 7 days, but then they've got something to say. The significance of this is indicated by verse 2. He said, literally, he answered. a little verse all of its own, one of the shortest verses in the Bible. And so this chapter should not be thought of as something just to get through, but as a key event in the story of the book of Job. When Job's friends open their mouth eventually, it is not so much to respond to what they have seen of Job's suffering, but to respond to what they have heard in chapter 3. Well, what is chapter 3 about? Well, the third thing we see in verse 1 is a headline statement, and he cursed the day of his birth. Job breaks the silence by pouring out the anguish that has been bottling up inside him. So far, we have seen what Satan has done to make Job suffer. Just to remind you, he has destroyed his possessions, he has killed his children, and he's attacked his flesh. But now we realize that that suffering has gone deeper. As is always the case, physical suffering is not just physical, but it goes deeper into the heart, the mind, and the soul. It is not enough just to see the man sitting on his ash heap, scraping his sores with a broken pot. We need to listen to the cry of his anguish. We must hear the story that only Job can tell. And what is that story? Verse 2. Verse 1. He cursed the day of his birth. So what we're looking at here is a curse. A curse in the ancient world is not just a bout of swearing or even a wish. It is actually a little bit more powerful than that. A curse is an attempt to bring the forces of destruction to work in the world. It is an attempt to use words to bring an action into motion. Now, Job knows that he's asking the impossible. He knows that the past can't be changed, but he's asking it anyway. He wants to curse himself and the universe out of existence. And so when we listen carefully to the curse and heard the heart and mind of Job, we will need to make sense of it. How can this be God's good word to us this morning? How can a godly man speak like this? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it good or is it bad? Is it over the top? Is it just a little bit too much? Is it even wicked? Well, as we read on in coming weeks, we'll see that his friends will certainly form the latter view. They will tell him basically just to man up and stop moaning. That he's going way overboard, that he's just wallowing in self-pity. In fact, eventually they'll say, Job, what has happened to you is what you deserved, and actually you've got away lightly, so you should shut up and stop complaining. And we're going to have to work out whether his friends are right or not. But here is the reason that it's very good that we came to church this morning to hear this passage. Because as we listen to Job's curse and immerse ourselves in the darkest chapter of the book, one of the darkest in the Bible, a brilliant thing is going to happen. We're going to be in the jeweler's shop. We're going to be looking at that beautiful, bright diamond of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. So let's pray indeed that will be our experience. Let's ask that God might speak to us. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are good and your words are good and true. And we thank you that this passage is exactly what each of us needs to hear this morning. We ask that as the storm rages outside and perhaps in our hearts and in our lives and in the world, that you might bring your peace into our hearts, the peace that comes through understanding the grace of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. We ask it for his sake. Amen. Well, hopefully you've got the passage open in front of you. If you're not used to this, this is what we do every week. We open the Bible and we give our attention to it. So do make sure you've got the passage open and you've got an outline in front of you as well. And you'll see from the outline that the passage, which is a poem, falls into two parts, a curse and a lament. So let's look at the curse first in verses 2 to 10. He begins with a statement of his subject. May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said, And it's literally, a man is conceived. Now, to help us to dive into the details, I want to offer a quick lesson or revision in reading Old Testament poetry. It was great to hear Lydia mention the different disciplines that some of our students are studying. I'm very thrilled personally that so many people are studying creative writing. That's great for all sorts of reasons. And for you guys who are not doing those sorts of disciplines, please don't tune out as we talk now about poetry, because we're going to be reading Old Testament poetry pretty much for the rest of this series. So a quick lesson or a quick revision. You may know that Old Testament poetry was written in Hebrew originally, and it's very powerful stuff. It works basically by three methods: repetition, intensification, and imagery. Now, that might sound like the kind of thing you left behind in Year 7 English, but trust me, it is simple and it's worthwhile. Let me give you an English example. It's raining, which happens to be true. There is the basic headline idea. But there's nothing unusual about it being raining in Lancaster. It's raining really badly today. And so if I wanted to ramp it up and tell you, I could say, well, it's raining heavily, which it probably is. I could say it's raining very heavily, and that conveys some information, but it's not very powerful. I could get a little bit more technical. I could say it's actually force 6 on the Beaufort scale of wind. And, well, that is technically true, but it doesn't grab your emotions unless you're a geography student. It doesn't put an image in your head or put a lump in your throat or anything like that, but poetry does those things. And so what Old Testament poetry does, it adds a second line. It's raining cats and dogs. See, there you've got all three of those little tools. You've got the repetition, you've got the intensification, and you've got the imagery or metaphor. It's raining cats and dogs. Repetition, intensification, and imagery. And that is it. That is all you need to know about Old Testament poetry for now. Now, the reason that matters, and the reason that poetry is called for here, is because Job has something truly terrible to say. See, this is what poetry is for. Poetry is brought in to describe the deepest human experiences. We don't go to the fish and chip shop and order our fish and chips using poetry, or you can try it if you want. But we do express love through poetry, and grief, and in this case, deep anguish. So I hope that's going to help us both this morning and in future weeks. But look again now at verse 3 and see it at work. Job begins his curse by asking that the day of his birth is wiped off the calendar. And then in the second parallel line, he pushes that even further. He intensifies that wish, and he says he wants the night, the very moment he was conceived by his parents, to be cursed as well. So I'm cursing the day of my birth, and then I'm thinking about even beyond that, 9 months earlier, to the moment that I was conceived. He is looking back and asking that those events that brought him into the world, the normal, joyful, blessed events of lovemaking and childbirth, be expunged from the history of the world as if they never happened. And he then takes that word pair, day and night, and then he runs with it in a series of curses all the way down to verse 9. So first, he attacks the day on which he was born in 4-6, and he rattles off 6 curses. Verse 4, that day may turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. Job is asking for darkness and oblivion to replace and to swallow the day of his birth, to delete it from history. And then in 6-9, he attacks the night of his conception, again in 3 rounds of curses. It's as if the usual form of 2 lines is now not enough for the violence he wants to express. And so he adds a line for extra power, verse 6. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. He's thinking back to the moments his parents made love and conceived him. And he grabs every available word and image for darkness and gloom and pours them out on that moment of his origins. He wishes that someone somewhere had the power to obliterate the day he was born and conceived. He wants a total blackout on his origins. Well, let's press in and notice a couple of particular details. Firstly, verse 8. We're going to come back to this Leviathan figure later in the book, but here he grabs hold of it, and all we need to know for now is that the Leviathan there's a little bit of thinking to do about this, a little bit of a debate, and I'm kind of thinking it through myself, but the Leviathan basically is a mythical creature who represents chaos. And so he is calling upon the occult magicians who have power to summon Leviathan from the pit. Think, if you like, the Balrog from the Lord of the Rings, coming up from the pit. He's enlisting those creatures to help him to destroy the moment in time that he was born. He wants to enlist the forces of chaos to reverse time, to obliterate his origins. Shocking stuff, I think. But if that's not shocking enough, it gets worse. If you're a Bible reader, you might just have noticed something vaguely familiar about Job's language in this section. Look at verse 4. That day, may it turn to darkness. Literally, he says, let there be darkness. And that should ring some alarming bells. To utter a curse that day turns to night, birth to barrenness, light to dark, life to death, is more than a wish that your own life ends, but it's a call for creation to go into reverse. In fact, the sequence of curses in 4 to 9 actually follow, if you look at them carefully, they follow God's acts of creation in Genesis 1. So God created the first day and blessed it. Job calls on that day and curses it. God said, let there be light. Job says, let there be darkness. God separated light from dark. Job says, let darkness reclaim the light. God created the lights of the sky to light up the day, the sun, moon, and stars in Genesis 1. Job says, let those lights disappear. Verse 9, may its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. In other words, Job is asking that the universe be unmade, that the goodness and blessing and order of creation that God in his purposes saw fit to exist be sent back to the chaos and darkness and disorder that was there at the start. And what are we to make of this? What are we to make of this from the mouth of someone who has been called exemplary, godly in verse 1? Blameless and upright, feared God, shunned evil, an opinion that God himself agrees with in verse 8, there is no one like this on earth. What are we to make of this? Well, for one thing, I think we can safely acknowledge at this point that suffering in God's world as a man or woman of God is complicated. See, Job's friends will tell him in no uncertain terms that he should stop complaining and understand that he has brought this on from some unconfessed sin. But we know from chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 8 that that is not the case, that his friends are wrong. And at the end of the book, God himself will confirm this again, that Job is not suffering because of a particular sin. He is experiencing undeserved suffering. He is suffering innocently. Satan, God's accuser, remember, has been given permission to do this. But Job has no idea why any of this is happening. And this is a reminder that we live in a world where a godly person, a believing person, a person of faith can experience real darkness and despair and anguish. And that becoming a believer does not make you immune from that. It's a reminder, isn't it, that there is something wrong with this world and we're part of it. There is an active, energetic evil in the world that, although it acts with God's permission in the sovereignty of God, is nonetheless terrible. But being a Christian, being a believer in the big God theology that we talked about recently, does not make you immune from real suffering. People sometimes say, don't they, I'm a Calvinist, I believe in God's sovereignty and I sleep like a Calvinist. I lie down at night and I rest my head on the pillow of God's sovereignty. Well, I love that idea because I'm a Calvinist. I believe in God's sovereignty. I believe that big God theology. But I don't always sleep well. In fact, sometimes sleep terribly. Because there are things to worry about in this world. We do not live in a world of neat balance and yin and yang and karma. We live in a world where evil, although evil exists in God's permission, where evil is evil, and good people and godly people can suffer so much anguish that they wish they'd never been born. That's the first thing. And therefore, one of the very practical and simple lessons of the book is, as Paul puts it in Romans 12:15, we weep with those who weep. Did you see that crash on the M6 just up near T-Bay last week? 2 children killed with, I think, their parents. 1 child survived. Can you imagine the grief that is going on in that family that remains right now? Well, here is a man whose 10 children have been killed. This is not a philosophical tract. These are the words of a real man going through real suffering. And that physical suffering, because Stoicism is just a nonsense, that physical suffering actually pierces his heart and soul. He is undergoing the most terrible spiritual, mental, emotional suffering, so that this godly man wishes he'd never been born and that those good times had never happened, and that actually the light and life and blessing of creation be thrown into reverse. And sometimes in the face of that reality, all we can do, or the least we can do, is weep with those who weep. To acknowledge that this is our world, to acknowledge that there are no easy answers, that there is no simple formula or liturgy to make things better, to realize that God does not always answer our questions, to realize that this is a broken world and we are part of it, and to shun those easy answers that say, don't worry, everything will be all right. Sometimes godly wisdom acknowledges that this is the case, that bad things happen. Things happen that should not be, for which there is no explanation given. And one of the wonderful things about church is that we do this together. I said to someone during the week who was telling me something very sad. I said, isn't it great that we have the church family? And that you don't need to go through this on your own. And you're not going to go through this on your own. It doesn't make it any less real. But it does mean we get the resources, the encouragement, the fellowship. We can weep with those who weep. But there is more to see here. We need to plunge a little bit further into the darkness before we see the light. Because in verse 10, Job now gives the reason for his wish. Verse 10, for, this is the conclusion to all of these curses, for it, that is the day of his birth, It did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. The grounds of all his cursing is his existence as a human being. If he'd never been born, if his mother had been given the curse of barrenness instead of the blessing of fertility, all the sadness and grief he's experienced would never have come to him. And all of that is now summed up in a single word. It's a key word in the book. It's that word trouble. The English word trouble is probably a little bit weak. The Hebrew is a little bit richer and can be translated variously as anguish or distress or restlessness. It's actually a terrible word. It's a hellish word. But as we'll see, this will be one of the little sparks of light that will light our way out of the darkness of this chapter. But first, Job's curse now turns in 11 to 26 to a lament. Now, while this section takes the form of a lament, that is a passionate expression of grief and sorrow, it is different to other laments in the Bible. I think possibly all other laments in the Bible. The laments in the Psalms, for example, are normally directed towards God. And they normally include a cry for salvation. So when people in the Bible lament, they say, "This is a terrible thing happening. God, please help me." But Job's lament does not do that at all, does it? He does not seem to be speaking to God. He seems to be speaking to himself or perhaps to the watching universe. And surprisingly, there is no cry for deliverance. He doesn't plea for help or restoration to his former life. Instead, he just asks the question, why? Why is he living this pointless life when he could be at rest in the realm of the dead? And this question takes this form of 4 why questions that divide up the passage. And it's important to keep in mind that these are wheelchair questions, not armchair questions. That is, they are not philosophical ponderings about the origins of suffering and evil. They are anguished explanations from a sufferer in the midst of his suffering. Why? 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 Let's look at each in turn. Firstly, 11 to 15. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? This first section returns to the day of Job's birth and asks, if I had to be conceived at all, well, why couldn't I be one of those statistics with the millions of children who die in the process of birth or infancy? And again, a shocking reversal of biblical norm. The blessing of birth, the protection of the womb, the welcoming knees, I think here from the father who receives the child from the midwife, the breast to feed and nourish the child, all of those good and celebrated things that we are so thankful for when they happen, he says, I wish they'd never happened. That normal movement from birth to infancy to childhood to family life that we hope and pray will be the story of this child born into the world, Job says it's a curse. Such blessing is a curse. His entrance into the world is a disaster that should never have happened. Why? Because he preferred to be at rest in the realm of the dead, verse 13. For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins, with rulers who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. There was a TV advert for Xbox a few years ago that was so shocking and tasteless that it was actually banned from TV very, very quickly. You can still see it on YouTube if you're interested. Don't look now, but do look it up later. It's worth seeing. And it depicts a mother giving birth to a baby boy who is fired like a projectile through the hospital window, then ages rapidly as he flies through the air. And the advertisement ends with this now old man crash landing into his own grave. And the slogan comes up, life is short, play more, Xbox. I did think about showing it, but I just thought it was too sort of tasteless and horrible. But do look it up. It's tasteless because it's advertising Xbox. Life is short, so waste it playing Xbox. But Job is longing here for that to be the trajectory of his life. He wants to press the fast forward button. He wants his life to be concertina, to be over as quickly as possible. He wants to be that old man crashing into his grave right now because he thinks, verse 13, that there is where rest can be found. That same longing is expressed in the second section, 16 to 19. Why was I not hidden in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? There the wicked cease from turmoil, and there the weary are at rest. Captives also enjoy their ease. They no longer hear the slave drivers shout. The small and the great are there, and the slave is freed from his master. Picking up that same wish for death at birth, he now develops this longing. Note the repeated use of the word there. In Job's mind, death is not this sort of abstract idea, but it's a place, it's a realm. In keeping with the Old Testament worldview, this place of the dead, the grave, Sheol, he wants to be there because he thinks that's where rest is. And then the third section, 20 to 22, why is light given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than treasure, who are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave. Light is a metaphor for life. And he says, why have I been given it? Why do I exist when there is anguish and trouble in this world? And he ramps up the imagery and piles on the bitterness. Later in the book, we're going to come back to this idea of seeking treasure, seeking the treasure of wisdom in chapter 28, one of the key parts of the book. But now, it's not wisdom he's seeking like treasure, it's death. He is hungry, greedy, desperate for it to come. And this is truly shocking and chilling. We're supposed to be disturbed by this. The reason it's so shocking is because elsewhere, the Bible sees the realm of the dead as the one place you must avoid at all costs. The writer of Ecclesiastes, another voice of wisdom, puts it like this. He says, anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. David in Psalm 6 says, no one remembers the Lord when he is dead. Who praises you from the grave? And in Psalm 116, the psalmist praises the Lord because he has saved him from the terror of death. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came upon me. I was overcome with trouble and sorrow, and I called on the name of the Lord. Save me, and the Lord saved me. Job's idea of salvation is to be sent to the grave. Do you remember that famous poem by Dylan Thomas? Do not go gently into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And Job reverses that. He is raging that he can't be there. He is raging against the continuation of the light. He is desperate for darkness because he cannot see any other path to the rest and peace that he longs for. His anguish is so deep that the only end he can imagine is for his life to be reduced to nothing, for him to find himself in the realm of the grave. He has no idea of any rest beyond that. What a terrible thing for a believer in God to say. And so as we come to the last section, we need to ask, is there any glimmer of hope? Verse 23. Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? It's only now that God is brought into the equation at all, but notice how negatively. Job asks why his life and that of others has been given, the implication being that God has given it to him, but now his way is hidden again by God. God has hedged him in, a word that he's used before to speak of the blessing of God in chapter 1, but now God has hedged him in this kind of trap that he cannot get out of, and there is no escape. And so we come to the final few verses. Can you see any glimmer of hope here? Verse 24. For sighing comes to me instead of food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. That language of creation going into reverse has now reached ahead on the seventh day of creation. That is what God made the world for rest, for peace. But Job cannot see it. There is no rest, there is no peace, only turmoil, only the chaos. And the way is hidden from him. And so the final word of this lament sends us into the rest of the book with that word ringing in our ears, the inversion of all God's purpose, the impossibility of rest, turmoil, the chaos of the uncreated universe swallowing up life. Well, there it is. There is Job chapter 3. One of the darkest, most hopeless chapters of the whole Bible. Is there any glimmer of hope? Well, remember that it is when you see the diamond against the jet black cushion that it's seen in its true glory. And the same is true of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. There is a correlation between how deeply we understand the darkness of this world and how clearly we grasp the light of the gospel. If we have a low view of sin, if we have a light view of evil, if we think actually that we're basically okay and this world is basically okay, then the gospel is never going to be very precious to us. As Jesus himself said, those who've forgiven much love much. And so this chapter is here to reveal the gospel and its glory. And let's do that now as we reflect on Job 3. Where is the gospel? Well, I want to suggest there are two hints of it here. Relationship and redemption. Relationship, first of all. So let's begin by thinking about the real puzzle of this passage, the real surprise of this passage. I think the shock of this passage is that Job never actually asks for death, and he never contemplates suicide as a way out of his predicament, and he never asks for deliverance, nor does he do what his wife advises him to do, curse God and die. He doesn't do any of those things. Instead, he goes beyond that. He goes beyond wishing that his miserable life will end. He goes back to the day of his origins and curses them. His wish is not to end his life, but that it had never begun. He wants never to have enjoyed the blessing of the life he had before. And he goes beyond that and calls the whole created order to dissolve in annihilation so that no one can enjoy life at all. Why does he react like this? One commentator says, grappling with this, that it's because suffering distorts our thinking, and there is some truth in that, possibly, but I don't think that's the answer. What we've got to do is remember that this comes after chapters 1 and 2, which means we know things that Job does not know. We know that all of this is happening as part of God's plan to answer the Satan's accusation that Job worships God for nothing. Remember, as Job reminded us, that Satan's blasphemous accusation is the key to the book. That Job is like a pet dog. That he only loves God for the good things he gives him. Take those things away, Job, and he will curse you to your face, Satan says, because no one, not even the best of the best, loves you for who you really are. but only because you throw them sticks and occasionally tickle their tummies. Which raises the stakes of the book to the central issue of the universe. As I said last week, this book is not about suffering, it is about God and whether he is worthy of our worship or not. And that is the issue that's being played out in this chapter and what follows. We know that, but Job doesn't know that. And so what does Job think is going on? Well, what Job thinks, as we will learn in future chapters, is that God has deserted him. As far as Job is concerned, he has done nothing particularly wrong, but he has found himself under the wrath of God. And this is why he's in such despair. He believes he's been judged by God and abandoned. That God, who he loves, has disowned him, deserted him, discarded him, and he doesn't know why. See, think about it like this. I'm going to spoil the plot for you now and tell you that the story actually does end well. Right at the end of the book, Job gets reinstated and vindicated. He has more children. God piles back that hedge of blessing again. So he's actually better off than he was before. And I want you to imagine that you could get into a time machine and you could go back to this moment and you could visit Job on his ash heap and say, Job, I've come from the 21st century. I've been reading the Bible and I want to tell you everything's going to be okay. This is what's going to happen. You're going to be great again. Everything you lost is going to be returned. Not only that, but you're going to get a book of the Bible named after you. You're going to be world famous. You're going to be a household name in 3,000 years' time. People are going to be talking about you, and you're going to help millions and millions of people in parts of the world that you don't even know exist. It's all going to be okay. All you've got to do is hang in there, Job, because you're going to get all the stuff back. You're going to be famous. You're going to do a load of good. It's going to be fine. And then you nip back in your time machine. I wonder if you can see the problem with that. It would prove Satan right after all, wouldn't it? Sit it out, Job, because one day God is going to give you everything back. That's just going to prove Satan right. It's going to prove that Job is only really in it for stuff, that God is only worth worshipping for stuff, that it's only worth keeping going with this faith thing because in the end it's my ticket to a good life. So hang in there and keep believing and you'll be all right in the end. But we can't get in a time machine, and Job doesn't know any of that. He is in the dark. Verse 23, the way is hidden from him. And so it is very significant that he does not curse God. Instead, he laments what he believes is the real problem, that he now lives in a world without relationship with God. His curse on creation and his longing for the grave is a way of saying, if I can't live with God's favor, I would rather not live at all. If I can't live in this world in relationship with God, then there is no point in having lived in the first place. Even though the blessed life he had before means nothing to him without God, he'd rather it didn't happen. Without God's smile on his face, without God in his life, Job cannot think of any reason to live, any reason to exist. Indeed, he cannot think of any reason for the creation to live at all. And the only answer, if there is no God, annihilation, is the only way forward. And here is the really shocking thing, that in chapter 42, God says, Job spoke what is right. Job got it right. And so in a strange and surprising and profound kind of way, Job's curse and lament are actually expressing negatively a very positive truth, which is that God is worthy of worship. Because if he isn't, then life is not worth living. Eric Ortland puts it brilliantly in his book on the final chapters of Job. He says this: "For all its vociferousness, Job's curse is like the photographic negative of his worship of God in 121. He expresses the same high view of God in a negative way. Job would not curse so terribly if he didn't value God so deeply." And I think this is very practical for all of us if you think about it. It means, for a start, if you do not know God this morning, then the Bible tells you that you can have no real hope or meaning in life. I know that's a hard and a offensive thing to say, but that is what this passage is teaching us. That you can live in this world with genuine hopelessness if you reject God. It's giving us a taste, isn't it, of the misery of unbelief, the hopelessness of unbelief. And a warning that no amount of wealth or health or family or success or blessing, no amount of escapism through pleasure or work or achievement or sex or drugs or man-centered religion can avoid that ultimate reality of the darkness of life without God. And if you're not a believer, this is the question, I think, for you. What are you hoping in, ultimately, if not God? As Blaise Pascal famously said, there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by the Creator, made and known through Jesus Christ. Or as C.S. Lewis also famously said, "If I find in myself desires for which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only explanation is that I was made for another world." Which means for the man or woman who is in relationship with God, you can never be truly hopeless. You can never be truly without hope, however you feel. Now, that does not mean, as we've already said, that the Christian life is one happy, clappy march to victory. It might be that there are real tears and real darkness. As I've already said, it might be that you will experience that moment when you wish you'd never been born. That is the world we live in. But in the final analysis, the believer in Jesus Christ can never be truly without hope, because even in that darkness, God is there. As we read in the book of Lamentations, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And so even if you feel without faith, without hope, God's faithfulness never ends. His love is everlasting. Or as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. That's the first thing, relationship. Job speaks these words to show us, ironically, paradoxically, how wonderful it is to have a relationship with God. It's the photographic negative of his worship. Second thing, though, is how do you know that is true? How do you know that God is there? How do you know that God is for you when you're in that place of darkness? Well, that brings us to our second reflection. The second glimmer of hope in this chapter is redemption. Look back again and note that final word again, the word turmoil. It's a word that is used in the Bible for the destructive forces of chaos and disorder. It's the word used in Exodus 15 of the Red Sea that killed the Egyptians. It's the word used sometimes of the thundering roaring waves of destruction that every Israelite fears. It's a word that comes to symbolize everything that is wrong with this world. This turmoil is a kind of a summary of the disordered world that has entered Job's life and pierced his heart and causes him to have no rest. And notice what is going on here. Paradoxically and prophetically, through the poem, Job is calling on those forces of turmoil to bring him the very rest that he longs for. In verse 8, he calls on those who have the power to summon Leviathan, the great mythical creature identified in the ancient world with turmoil. He calls on them, and he calls down the chaos and darkness and everything that is opposed to light in order to bring him the rest he so desires. He calls on trouble to end his trouble. He calls on chaos to bring him peace. He calls on turmoil to bring rest. And because Job is a prophet, he speaks better than he knows. Because as he grapples with the impossible, for rest in the midst of death, for peace in the grave, something contrary to what the Bible promises, he is actually anticipating something that we will see if we keep reading. That if we keep reading, we'll see that it won't be Leviathan who fixes the pain, but it will be God himself who steps in to overcome the forces of chaos and bring peace once and for all. And Job will see, as he puts it in chapter 19, that his Redeemer lives. That there is life beyond the grave, not in the grave, but beyond the grave. But what he doesn't see is who that Redeemer is and how he does it. He does not see that it's by his anguish and suffering that he will bring peace. And we do see that. And that is why this gospel shines so brightly in Job 3. Because we know that a man called Jesus came into the world and suffered in anguish like Job. And we know that it was at the moment of his death, alone on the cross, the greatest anguish that has ever come on a human being, where his body, mind, and soul was pierced with the turmoil of a broken world, where all the evil and chaos was unleashed on him so that he would cry those terrible words, my God, why have you forsaken me? We know that it was that moment of true despair and darkness, the God-forsaken hell of the cross. It was at that moment that Jesus himself pierced Leviathan, conquered the forces of darkness, opened the way to rest. Job calls on turmoil to end his turmoil. And what he didn't know is it would be the Lord Jesus Christ who would do it. These words are picked up by the prophet Isaiah, who speaks of the suffering servant like this. He says, out of the anguish of his soul, he will see light and be satisfied. He shall bear their iniquities, because he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Let's pray. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. Heavenly Father, we thank you that your words in Job 3 are ultimately so full of hope and light, because they point the way to Jesus. We ask that you'd forgive us for those times we try and escape the reality of the darkness of this world through hopeless dead-end means, through shallow escapism or man-centered religion. But we pray that we'd be those who weep with those who weep, and those who lament with hope that your purposes for light and life have been secured in the cross of Christ, who bore the chaos, who bore the curse, so that we might live. Amen.